which you can decide whether you would like to use yourself this way. But crises are distinguished by the fact that they have some aspect that is new. We haven't thought about it before. The newness might come from something that's genuinely new under the sun, or at least new to the jurisdiction. So, two examples. When SARS hit China and other countries in this region pretty severely, SARS was a brand new disease that nobody had ever seen before, and no one knew how it behaved. H1N1, much less severe, same kind of story. That novelty made it extremely difficult to deal with SARS and created special demands on the public health system. Or a slightly different version of it, New York City in 1999 had an epidemic of West Nile virus. Not a new disease. It had been seen in the Middle East, but it had never before seen in North America, and it took them more than a month to identify it definitively because it had never been in North America. The novelty made it harder to deal with these kinds of things. So anyway, one aspect of this is that maybe something new under the sun or new to the jurisdiction. Second element of novelty might be that the scale, it's a familiar type of event, but the scale of the event brings it way out of the range of experience. Indonesia had seen tsunamis before, but the tsunami of 2004 was so large, so sudden, its impact so widespread, that it was as if it were something that you had never seen before. And the novelty of that circumstance meant that the contingency plans that you had ready were completely inadequate for what you were responding to, and had to be supplanted by many kinds of things that went way beyond what you had planned. And a third possibility of novelty is that it could be a combination of two things, each of which you might have thought about, but when they come together, especially at a large scale, create novel circumstances. So in New Orleans, they'd seen hurricanes before. They also had prepared for flooding. When they had a hurricane with the rupture of the levees that created extreme flooding, they had a novel circumstance that they were not ready for. Two kinds of things characterize novel events and that mean or explain why they place extraordinary demands on emergency responders. One is simply that the preparations you've made in advance may be completely inadequate, and so you implement them, but you still haven't dealt with the crisis. It's still there. It's still very, very pertinent, very, very severe, and you've got to go on to new things. You have thrown at it everything you have, and it doesn't work. There's another possibility, which is perhaps even more insidious, which is that the things that you have prepared may actually turn out to be counterproductive. They may work against solving the problem rather than in favor of it. Take SARS in another aspect as an example. The city of Toronto in Canada had a very severe SARS experience, the worst in the Western Hemisphere. And almost all of the cases, I believe it was approximately 80% of the SARS cases, occurred in hospitals. The people got infected after they had sought medical attention in first-class hospitals. Why was that? Because these hospitals had standard ways that they dealt with respiratory infections that were based on their expectations about what normal influenza or normal pneumonia, how it behaved, and what kinds of precautions to prevent further infection were appropriate when people came with seasonal flu or with pneumonia. And they applied those things to the patients that came to the hospital with SARS. But if you had an overcrowded emergency room and you had two cots and you put a patient with SARS next to somebody else who didn't have it, what they didn't know is that conventional way of dealing with routine emergencies could in fact speed the spread of SARS. They didn't recognize that their medical personnel, the nurses and doctors, with ordinary precautions, could still contract SARS. So they started to knock out some of their medical staff, and they contaminated hospitals and they had to close the hospitals down and move the patients because the hospitals were contaminated with SARS. So there's an example of an organization doing what under normal circumstances was perfectly acceptable professional behavior, making the situation worse. In 1995, when the terrorist group Aum Shinrikyo attacked the Tokyo subways, police and cleanup crews that dealt with that issue, in fact, succumbed to the chemical agent because they did the normal things that they would do, but under the conditions of a novel attack with chemical weapons, they were in jeopardy. So it is the case that what we do for ordinary emergencies may either be inadequate or it may be counterproductive. One other thing I think is really important, and I'm going to only touch on this here because it would take us a couple of hours to work through this in detail, and happy to answer questions about it, but we simply don't have the ability to do justice to this issue. But what I'd like to argue is that organizations that do emergency response need to develop two different capacities, one that deals with routine emergencies and one that they can put into effect when they're dealing with something unexpected, novel, what we call a crisis here. Let me illustrate that. I hope. For routine emergencies, the way that we would deal with this is to develop contingency plans for different threats, and we would develop our personnel. In fact, preparing for routine emergencies is an incredibly important and incredibly productive thing for emergency response organizations to do. Do not take anything that I say to suggest that becoming excellent at handling routine emergencies is not a wonderful thing to do. And many of the things that you discussed this morning are exactly that. Preparing for routine emergencies, or preparing for things that wouldn't be a routine emergency if you didn't prepare for them. So, and I think you could describe this under the umbrella of professionalization of emergency response. You are selecting personnel who may already have education, or you give them more education, you train them, you put them through exercises, so when they're confronted with something that is likely that you've anticipated, they can deal with it. You standardize practices and procedures. You've created what we call SOPs, standard operating procedures. And so people know what they're supposed to do. When such an emergency occurs, they can spring into action and carry out the things that they're prepared for. Leadership under these conditions are based both by authority. You have hierarchical authority, and leaders have expertise because they've trained for these things themselves. They've prepared themselves for it. And generally, leaders who are in those positions have experience during their careers so that they've seen a lot of things and know how to behave under those conditions. The command structure tends to be hierarchical, not necessarily in a completely authoritarian way, but because the organization knows what it's supposed to do, because the leadership deploys them, there is simply a way of acting quickly with authority. Decision makers know what their roles are, and other people know what they're supposed to do, and the organization implements them. And given this prior preparation, training, good leadership, etc., response organizations can aim for precision execution. They can get themselves ready to deploy really effectively. So think of organizations like your fire service, which deal with fires all the time, perhaps multiple fires every day. They can develop an extraordinary degree of professionalism and excellence, and they can pride themselves on how well they execute and act with precision when an automobile catches fire on the highway, when a residential building bursts into flames, even when a factory catches fire and they're dealing with a very large fire. They're ready for it, they're experienced, they know what to do, they can execute precisely. The alternative is crisis leadership. And here I would argue that there is a very different style of leadership that's required that But what makes this very hard